Hi everyone, we're talking today about the second part of chapter 11, still wrapping up the French Revolution here. There's a lot of information, and of course we just really kind of touch on all of it anyway, but there's a lot to cover, so we'll get right to it. So let's start off with Napoleon. Napoleon was born 1769 on the island of Corsica to the family that was of minor nobility. So, as most young nobles did, he entered the military. And in the military, he became an artillery officer who was recognized for his great talent in strategy. Bonaparte joined this conspiracy then that overthrew the French Directory. These politicians were planning to seize power, and they needed someone strong in that role, a strong general. And they couldn't think of anyone better than this young military genius named Napoleon Bonaparte. So once the Directory was overthrown, this era of military dictatorship began under Napoleon's leadership. Now, the bourgeoisie expected that Napoleon would protect wealth and influence because he himself was the son of nobility. But it's not exactly how things happened. In 1802, they made him first consul for life, but then in 1804, with that power right, he's the ruler for life. He can pretty much do what he wants to do. So he crowns himself Emperor of the French. And here's an image of that, some artwork by David that is called The Coronation of Napoleon and Josephine. And you can see Napoleon in the center with the crown above his head that he's going to crown himself. So Napoleon was an enlightened despot. If you remember from chapter 10, we talked about despotism. A despot was an absolute ruler who was often cruel. So an enlightened despot is one who will accept some reform. Napoleon belonged to this tradition from the 18th century enlightened despotism. He admired administrative uniformity and efficiency, but he did not like feudalism and religious persecution. So in Napoleon's government then, there was a little more religious tolerance, which also, let's go back up to this picture here for just a minute. You can see here that we have these religious figures here that would normally crown an emperor. Especially in the Roman Empire, the Pope would have crowned an emperor. But here we have these religious figures. He is showing that he has authority above them. So he can allow religious toleration because this kind of symbolically shows that he is going to allow religious toleration to a degree, and that he is not going to force that that same old religious tradition as before. France's strong central government gave Napoleon the chance to concentrate power in his own hands, which provided him with taxes and soldiers necessary for his wars. So this brilliant general that they picked to rule, what's he good at? He's good at war. So he's going to continue fighting. He's going to try very hard to expand the French Empire. To suppress his opponents, Napoleon also used instruments of a police state, including secret agents and just random arbitrary arrest, summary trials, and even executions. So he used propaganda to help shape public opinion, to prevent criticism, and to promote support for his cause. A lot of leaders did that. A lot of leaders today still do that. They use public opinion in order to shape the image that they want, or they shape the image that they want by manipulating public opinion, would be a good way to say it. Now, back in Napoleon's day, obviously, he wasn't on Facebook, Twitter, or any kind of social media to do that, but still propaganda nonetheless. And through that, the liberty of the press came to an end. Now remember, these people are wanting an enlightened despot to rule. So taking away the liberty of the press is not very enlightened. So people are going to kind of regret this role that he's taking on. The printers had to swear an oath of obedience to the emperor. And so at that point, any kind of newspaper or pamphlet that would have been written in that time period was converted then to strict, straight-up propaganda for Napoleon's benefit. Napoleon, in terms of the church, tried to close the breach between the state and the Catholic Church that had started during the Revolution. And this kind of reconciliation actually gained approval of the French people. So that is an example of enlightenment. He negotiated the agreement with the Pope called the Concordat of 1801, which recognized Catholicism as the religion of the majority. Now, he didn't call it an official state religion, because if it's called an official state religion, then everyone in France would have had to identify as Catholic, whether they were or not, and they would have had to put up a good show. So in this way, he's still able to allow religious tolerance, but he's also able to appease the church to say, you know, it's the religion of the majority. The old regime in France had a lot of conflicting legal codes that prevented unity. So Napoleon wanted to unify these laws to incorporate the principles of the revolution. He put, in terms of the principles of the revolution, those were equality before law, protection of property rights, and abolition of serfdom, which obviously there's no equality in serfdom. If you have someone who's serving as a not as a peasant, but as someone like a slave in that kind of situation. And also the secular character of state, which is what he continues by allowing religious tolerance and not having the church tied so tightly into the government. The Napoleonic Code denied equal treatment to workers, women, and children. It reflected Napoleon's personal attitude and views of the times. And slavery was reinstated in French colonies, which is another violation of this equality. So while he's abolishing serfdom, slavery starts coming back into play in French colonies. Napoleon favored public education, but he favored it with a secular curriculum. You know, most times education was church related, so he felt like it should be secular, which means, you know, worldly or not of the church. This would provide capable of officials to administer his laws and lead armies, but also to indoctrinate obedience and loyalty in these young kids. So while young kids at this point in history weren't exactly going to school, he thought, you know, if we start schools now and we train kids right, they'll become members of the army later, and they'll be loyal and obedient to his cause. Napoleon's financial and economic policies were designed to strengthen France and his popularity. You know, it has to be a win-win for Napoleon. This aided the industry through tariffs and loans, fostered commerce, and protected currency from inflation. Napoleon created the Bank of France. And they also provided food at low prices and stimulated employment. This is a big benefit to people. And so those people who were looking for an enlightened despot, they were finding it in elements of Napoleon's rule. The idea of buying low-cost food and having jobs plentiful, that was a big deal, and definitely an enlightened kind of role. Now, some of the Europeans welcomed his policies, especially those that we just talked about, but others resented his tyranny. By 1810, Napoleon pretty much became the virtual ruler of Europe. He dominated the continent except for the Balkans. The Napoleonic Code spread, effective civil service, the abolition of serfdom. He equalized taxes, kind of expanded this freedom of religion or religious tolerance, the idea of civil marriage and civil rights for Jews, and he ended clerical courts. Napoleon promoted secular education and improved public health. Now, again, the secular education, think about that. If, at first he's promoting secular education in France, which would create young people from France who were dedicated and loyal to Napoleon and his military. So as territory expands, you have more young children that you're training up the way you want them to be trained in order to serve in your military. So that was the purpose for that. He attacked the privileges of aristocracy and clergy, which is something that, again, the bourgeoisie really didn't expect to happen. So that's coming into play, and obviously the aristocracy and the clergy are not happy about it. The diffusion of revolutionary institutions weakened the old regime in much of Europe, but it accelerated modernization of 19th century Europe and turned conquered lands into satellite kingdoms. So again, Napoleon is using his expansion of territory to exploit them for his benefit. But as you've heard, what goes up must come down. So Napoleon's rise also resulted in his fall. Napoleon's main opponent was Great Britain. Any power that dominated the continent would pose a threat to the British commerce, to the British sea power, and to the island kingdom. Napoleon decided that the best way to attack the British would be to attack the British economy. Under the continental system, he barred all countries under his control from buying French goods. The French bourgeoisie began to turn against him then because of that economic distress that resulted from that continental system. Napoleon's efforts to enforce the system led to two catastrophic blunders: the occupation of Spain and the invasion of Russia. Spain had been an ally of France's since 1796, but Spain was disappointing to Napoleon. They failed to prevent the Portuguese from trading with Britain. And in 1808, he deposed the Spanish ruler and made his brother, Joseph, King of Spain. So this Spanish ulcer, as it's called, drained Napoleon's treasury, his troops, and it gave Britain then a foothold on the continent, and it inspired the patriots in other countries to resist the French. The disaster in Russia happened in 1812. Napoleon assembled the Grand Army, one of the largest in history, of 614,000 men. He intended this to be a crushing blow that would force the Tsar to just immediately kind of surrender and make peace. But the Russians avoided these pitched battles and they retreated eastward and they refused peace. In June of 1812, the Grand Army crossed into Russia and were drawn deeper and deeper into the country, which was far from the lines of supply for the French troops. The army was greatly reduced by this. The extra travel inland into the country brought lots of sickness, disease, and hunger to the troops, and so they began to retreat. This retreat then was miserable. There were 95,000 people trying to retreat through frost, snow. It was a deadly situation all the way around. And by mid-December, remnants of the army staggered into East Prussia. And this is an image that shows Napoleon's Europe in 1810. By 1810, he dominated most of the continent. So the fall in Russia leads the Germans to pursue this war of liberation. German intellectuals began to use nationalist language to call for liberation against Napoleon. So nationalist language, we're going to talk a lot about nationalism this semester, but it's also propaganda, and it's like creating stories of inspiration. So it's often confused with patriotism. They're really not the same thing, although they really do border, sometimes. So, and at different points in history, they are used interchangeably. So at this point, we're going to call it nationalist language. And we'll discuss that more throughout the semester. But so they are creating these stories, these folklore stories, to unite the people of Germany against Napoleon. The domination of Germany stimulated the reform movement among bureaucracy and officer corps. To survive, Prussia needed to learn lessons from the French Revolution. So they aroused citizens and to make them better soldiers. So if you can inspire citizens and get them on the same team, get them fighting for the same cause, instead of making them mercenaries, warm bodies that are just going to go out and get killed, then the war works better, right? So they took that lesson from the French, and that's where that nationalist language comes in. Again, it's all about the propaganda. And they selected their officers on merit instead of nobility, which was very important. Remember, as far as Napoleon went, he was from a minor noble family, not any one major. So he actually proved himself as a talented general. So in this time, the German officers are selected on their merit as well, rather than for nobility. And also the elimination of social abuses would encourage the Prussians to serve the state willingly. So that's what they're trying to use in order to build their army. Among the important reforms in Prussia from 1807 to 1813 were the abolition of serfdom, which is very enlightened, right? Granting of self-administration to towns, awarding of army commissions on merit. Again, that's also enlightenment. The elimination of cruel punishment is one of those things that the Enlightenment really focused on as well. And the establishment of national conscription. So conscription basically is the draft, okay? So they established a required service in the military. In 1813, the Reform Party forced the Prussian king, Frederick William III, to declare war on France. And in the War of Liberation in 1813, these fierce Prussian soldiers drove the French out of Germany. In his final defeat in October 1813, Allied forces from Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Sweden defeated Napoleon at Leipzig. In 1814, the Allies captured Paris. Napoleon was abdicated from the throne and was exiled to Elba. He escaped from Elba, invaded France again in 1815, which is known as the 100 Days that he tried to come back into rule. Napoleon raised his new army, moved against the Allied forces in Belgium, but at Waterloo in June 1815, the British and the Prussians defeated Napoleon again. This time, the Allies sent him to St. Helena, which was an island in the South Atlantic, 1,000 miles off the coast of southern Africa. So, that would keep him very far away and, prohibit him from coming back to try yet again to overthrow the French government. He actually died 6 years after that. The French Revolution was a decisive period in shaping the modern West because it implemented many ideas of the philosophers. It destroyed the hierarchy and corporate society of the old regime. It promoted some of the interests of the bourgeoisie. It quickened the growth of the modern state, and it weakened aristocracy. The bourgeoisie had access to the highest positions in the state. The French Revolution was important because it ends the dynastic state, where a dynasty passes down control from one person to another in the family. and it was transformed into a modern state. The liberal thought of the Enlightenment was expressed in various forms or reforms of the revolution. This idea of absolutism and the divine right of kings was a thing of the past at this point because of constitutions that guaranteed natural rights. The French Revolution served as a frame of reference for many 19th century movements. And the French Revolution inspired generations of revolutionaries and gave birth to modern nationalism. So again, there's that word. We will be talking about it a lot. Also, the French Revolution unleashed potentially destructive forces of the modern state, like total war, nationalism, fanatical utopian mentality, and extremism. These are things that come about from nationalism. You know, when we talk about propaganda, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but nationalism can be very divisive, and that's why it's important to know and to recognize so that you can identify it, because it exists even today.